Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here. Distinguished ambassadors, senior officials, dean, directors of programs, my colleagues. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here to the Weiser Diplomacy Center here at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. We're excited about today's event, the Ambassadors Forum, which we have been doing for a few years now. This year's topic is really quite timely. Europe and America, where are we and where are we going? I'm Ambassador Susan Page, and I'm the director of the Weiser Diplomacy Center. I'm also a professor of practice here at the Ford School and a professor from practice at the law school. I'm delighted that today's forum is co-sponsored by the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, WCEE, one of the international centers here at U of M that is part of U of M's College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, which is actually the college I graduated from some other decade. Okay, some other century, as my students like to point out. Well, that was, a whole different century. Like, let's not put it that way. But, so we're really excited that the Weisers have actually funded, through gifts, both of our centers, and the Weiser Diplomacy Center was established here at the Ford School in 2019 by a generous gift from Ron and Eileen Weiser with the purpose of creating a dynamic hub for the study of and practice of diplomacy at U of M with a real focus on practical skills and the teaching of diplomacy and international studies by skilled practitioners who have been doing this sort of work for decades. So we actually sponsor fellows, we do career training, we provide professional guidance and internships and other opportunities for both the undergraduate students as well as the graduate students. Of course, people study from all walks of life from U of M, and so I can certainly say I've been pleased to have students in my classes from all over campus, PhD in math, engineering, the Ford School, law school, the C's for environment. So it's a really good mix. So I'm also going to now introduce Douglas Northrup. He is the acting director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. And then once Douglas finishes, we will then, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Newman, and he will then introduce our speakers. And I do have to say that we had 4 distinguished guests, and unfortunately, one of them developed COVID, tested positive this morning. So we've had to scramble a little bit, but of course, our distinguished practitioners will fill in as best they can, and they will take questions after their remarks. So thank you very much, and here's to Douglas.
Well, thanks very much for that. I'm just going to take a moment. We'll try that. Is that legible out there? Okay, thank you. So as you heard, I'm the acting director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. I'm also a professor of history and Middle East studies. This actually is one of the best parts of my job, I would say. It's such a pleasure to collaborate with our partners at the Weiser Diplomacy Center and also at the Ford School. And we're really proud to co-sponsor tonight's event, the Roundtable. The Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia is part of the International Institute at U of M. We are dedicated to advancing and disseminating interdisciplinary knowledge and promoting public engagement with the institutions, cultures, and histories of this part of the world, of Europe as well as Eurasia. We do this several ways. First of all, through public events like this one. Lectures, film screenings, art exhibitions, and others are on our calendar. We also offer student support for both undergraduate and graduate students and support for faculty members through research funding. And then also we have a range of unique community outreach initiatives in support of civil society in our part of the world. Given the crucial and constantly shifting political, economic, and security-related landscapes of the inter-European and transatlantic relationships, we also think it's absolutely essential for U of M to host conversations with experts on matters like this. Today's subjects are top of mind for many of us in our world at the Weiser Center, and we're all looking forward to hearing the ambassador's thoughts about these current conditions. And with that, I'll pass it off to Ambassador Newman.
Thank you.
Let me just do a quick introduction. You don't get to escape that.
Oh, okay.
So I'm pleased to introduce Ambassador Ronald Newman. He is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He's also a former ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. 3 countries as ambassador, 4 countries of war, as he likes to say. Earlier in his career, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, Director of the Office for Iran and Iraq, Deputy Chief of Mission in the United Arab Emirates and Yemen, and Principal Author in Tabriz, Iran. He also served in Iraq from 2004 to 2005, working closely with the U.S. military. Newman is the author of The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan, and 3 Embassies, 4 Wars, a personal memoir. In 2018, he received the American Foreign Service Association's Lifetime Contributions to American Diplomacy Award. A Vietnam veteran, he holds a BA in History and an MA in Political Science. So with that, Ambassador Newman, I'll let you kick it off.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it is great fun to be back here, although I must say, can everybody hear okay? Is the mic working properly? Okay. As we were walking over, we all wondered, why are you all here? It's beautiful outside. Nonetheless, having said that, we're glad you're here. And we hope we can enlighten you a little, entertain you perhaps. I have 2 colleagues with you. As you know, we were to have 3. I think you have bios, don't you?
I don't think they have bios.
Ah, all right. Well, I'm going to give you...
There was a bio on the website.
Very, very short. I'm going to do less honor to my colleagues than Susan did for me, actually, but I want to move the program along. So I have Rose Gottmuller, who was Undersecretary of State and who has had a major role in multiple arms control negotiations, worked as Deputy Secretary General, that's right, title of NATO, and so in speaking about NATO, we couldn't have somebody better prepared for that. And also someone who, having been intensively involved in negotiations with the Russians over arms control, brings huge experience to that. Ambassador John Byerly on my left. John was ambassador in Bulgaria. He was ambassador in Russia. He had multiple tours in Russia. Actually, both my colleagues are Russian language linguists, daunting prospect. And so in speaking about U.S.-Russian relationships, we have someone with us who is not just an academic student of this, but has observed it over many years through many vicissitudes and transformations. So he can speculate on that. My role primarily is to be a moderator. However, as you understood, we had an excellent 3rd colleague, Kathleen Novelli, who's been Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs and Deputy Trade Representative in negotiations and Vice President of Apple, and a superb colleague to talk about the economic aspects of our subject today, and who unfortunately was struck down with COVID this morning. None of us yet are showing any signs. We hope we're all okay. I just had it 3 weeks ago. You're all a long way from us, so you should be safe, but if you want to come up and talk afterwards, we feel fine, but you've been forewarned. So we have, having now absolved ourselves of all responsibility, we're delighted to talk to you. So anyway, I'm going to make a few comments about the economic portions that we were going to talk about that will not by any means take Kathy's place because she's a real expert on this stuff, but we didn't want to leave the subject out. So on to our subject of the day, and just to refresh your memories, the European relationship has been really our most critical relationship since the end of World War II. Many of the institutions that are formative in our security and our prosperity, the International Monetary Fund, the UN itself, these were designed with our European colleagues at the end of World War II, and they have provided a framework of security and of great prosperity to the United States for 70-odd years. The question which people are now dealing with as we see things revolving, changing, moving, lots of change in the Trump administration. There was change already in the Biden administration. There was more change in the first Trump. So we wanted to get at the question of whether we are looking at now permanent seismic changes, or are we looking at the periodic perturbations in the force that have gone on for some years. Now, we're probably not going to answer that definitively, and I know that with all the aspects of that question, we're not going to answer it across the board, and in fact, we're going to try to have some very short presentations to allow plenty of time for questions so we can take it where you want to take it. I've been at many programs where the speaker says, we really want to hear your views. By the end of the speech, you've got 15 minutes left. You get one long-winded question and answer, and you're done. We'll try to do a little better than that today. But we've plucked out of this whole gamut of potential issues 3 subjects to look at. One is the US and NATO. And basically, the question here in all of them is now, is this a new period? Can NATO survive? What's happening? We've pulled out the US and Europe, and this is primarily focused on the economic relationship. And I will attempt a few comments on that without believing that they will be as sufficient as we would have had. And then we have the US and Russia, which are going through fundamental questions of where we stand, or where we will stand, whether we'll stand at all. And Ambassador Biley will go at that. So without more ado, Rose, can I ask you to start off on the US and NATO?
Certainly. I am delighted to be here, and thank you so much for coming today. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be able to speak to this audience. And I'm looking forward to also hearing your views, how it looks to you here in Michigan as to the relationship between the United States and the NATO alliance. In general, I feel that there is good bipartisan support for NATO in the United States, but I'm certainly happy to hear your views about it from where you sit and where you stand here in Michigan. I'm an Ohio girl. I grew up in Columbus. Sorry about that. But I did spend 6 years of my elementary school time in Dearborn when my dad had a job in Detroit. So it's kind of a bit on east side. Okay, let me talk about NATO and where NATO is going. NATO had already started some profound changes. And believe it or not, it was on the back of President Obama and his message back in 2012, 2013, that the United States was going to pivot to Asia to address a new threat arising from China as it was modernizing its military forces and showing more aggressive action toward Taiwan and toward our allies in the region, the ROK, South Korea, and also Japan. So that start was an early shock to the alliance at that time, but a second important shock in 2014 was the first invasion of Ukraine when Putin seized Crimea and destabilized the Donbass. So those were 2 forces that were in train already in 2012 to 14, and they have only accelerated in the time since. And I was the Deputy Secretary General at NATO when Trump was in office for the first time, and he continued that push, but in a way that was extraordinary because for the first time, he threatened the NATO allies. He came to NATO, I was there in May 2017 when he came to NATO headquarters for the first time and said, I am sick and tired of you freeloading allies. And unless you start paying up and paying for your own defense, I am not going to fulfill the Article 5 commitments to you. That is, if one of you is attacked, this is the famous all for one and one for all, right? This is part of the Washington Treaty from 1949. Article 5, if one NATO ally is attacked and asks for assistance, all NATO allies will come to their aid. And Trump basically said in 2017, don't count on it unless you start paying more for your own defense. It was the right thing to do. Every president, whether Democratic or Republican, has really said, why are the allies freeloading so much? There's a great National Security Council meeting report from JFK's time, John F. Kennedy, when he said to his Secretary of Defense at the time, I am sick and tired of these NATO allies free riding on us. They need to spend more on their own defense. It was Donald Trump who finally got the allies to take notice that they were at the end of their time of prioritizing social welfare programs and letting the United States foot the bill on European defense. So he really put them on notice in that period of his first term in office. And frankly, I was working for Jens Stoltenberg as Secretary General then, Norwegian diplomat and senior figure. He and I both applauded the fact that Donald Trump was finally getting the allies to pay up when they had agreed in 2014 at the time of the first Russian invasion of Ukraine to put 2% of their gross domestic product to defense. They had agreed that, but when Donald Trump came into office, only 3 countries were at 2% of GDP. One of them was the United States, the second was the UK, and the third was Greece. Well, Greece doesn't have a very, I would say, intensely modernized armed forces, but Greece puts all of their retirement pensions for the military into their defense budget. So of course they had an enormous defense budget. So, you know, it was that kind of problem, and Donald Trump really pushed them to spend. Now, I will say that it is Vladimir Putin's second invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that really upped the pressure on the allies and led them to embrace, finally, the necessity of modernizing their armed forces. And really, so it was that combination, I like to say. The momentum first came from Donald Trump in 2017, 18, 19, but then it was Vladimir Putin who really pushed the momentum with that invasion. And so by the time Trump arrived back in office a second time, the allies were in the midst of I hate to say it, but rearming themselves and really modernizing their armed forces, putting the proper investment into defense. And so they agreed and were ready to agree at the NATO summit this last summer in Vilnius. I'm sorry, it was in Latvia, in Riga, beg your pardon, that they were ready to spend actually 6% of GDP, of which 3.5% would be on military expenditures and 1.5% would then be on other expenditures related to their infrastructure. And so that was a very, very important step forward for the allies. And I think that honestly, to my mind, we are on a very good track now with the allies. So the challenge has come in the last week when Russia sent a number of drones into Polish airspace. And the question is out there, okay, what exactly was Russia up to? The Belarusians, did inform, apparently, the Poles and the Lithuanians that this incursion was happening and participated in informing them so that they could effectively shoot down and defend themselves against these drones. Russia has denied that there were any targets being targeted in Poland. So they keep pushing the message that it was an accident. But in the UN Security Council meeting that Poland called last Friday, the message from Poland and the NATO allies was very clear. This appeared to be an intentional incursion, and Russia is playing a very dangerous game. Now, the message I want to leave you with as we turn to talking about Russia and Europe more generally and the economic side is that NATO stepped up to this task because the argument is out there, if the United States and Donald Trump he's not very enthusiastic, right? Still, even though NATO is paying up now, even though NATO is investing in its own defense, he's still not very enthusiastic. When this drone incursion occurred last week, he said, oh, there's been a drone incursion in Poland, here we go. But you have not heard the president speaking up about defending NATO territory. It was the U.S. representative at the UN on Friday who spoke up and said the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory if necessary, reiterating our commitment to the NATO allies. But where's the president? And that's the question that is in everybody's mind. Is the president saying the right thing about NATO now and again, but actually ready essentially to back away from supporting the alliance? So that's the big question. And the next question then is, can the allies do it on their own? And the message I want to leave you with is I was very impressed with how all of the allies participated quickly in this response on last Wednesday night. When the Poles were seeing these UAVs coming at them, these drones coming at them, they had no idea, but they immediately had the Dutch Air Force there with their F-35s, Polish F-16s, the Italians with their airborne warning and control system, and the NATO tanking refueling capability available to the Poles as well immediately. This was essentially an all-NATO response. NATO has been practicing Baltic air policing, protecting the Baltic states from frequent Russian incursions in that area now for years, including when I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. So their ability to respond quickly with multiple countries participating in the response is now well established and well practiced, and it paid dividends on last Wednesday night. So my point to you, my message to you is, yeah, it's going to be a very serious shock to the system if somehow the United States backs away, pivots to Asia, removes military equipment and personnel from Europe and moves it to Asia to defend and help there against a rising China. But I believe that NATO has the capacity and capability to perform effectively, even if the United States is taking less of a leadership role. I do not believe the United States will withdraw from NATO, but if it is taking less of a leadership role, I do believe that the other allies will, and can step forward to help to continue to defend against Russian aggression. So I will leave it at that. I look forward to our discussion, and thank you again for the opportunity to be with you here today.
Super provocative, interesting, and mercifully quick. Excellent. John, over to you. What do we expect from Russia?
Well, why are we even bothering to talk about Russia? Does Russia really matter anymore? Well, yeah, somebody said. Well, first of all, I do want to say thanks to the Weiser Center and to the Ford School for organizing this and hosting us here. This is, I think, my fourth or fifth time in this auditorium, and I never fail to get questions that I struggle to answer. So I hope you will, hold up the reputation of the team. So why is Russia really important? These things are self-evident, I think, but it's good to go back and sort of establish a baseline. There are really three reasons why we need to consider Russia an existentially important nation, not just for us, but for the world as a whole. The first one is geographical. Russia is the largest country on Earth in terms of territory, and by a lot. The second largest country, Canada, Russia is 70% bigger than Canada. So 11 time zones. It borders on areas of the world and countries that are vital to the security and economic interests of the United States, Europe, Middle East, China, Japan, Korea, the Arctic. And did I mention that we share a common sea border with Russia, and in fact that Russia considers part of the United States, or remembers well that part of the United States, Alaska, used to belong to Russia. So geographically, a superpower, no question about it. Secondly, that enormous landmass holds enormous resources that makes Russia a resource superpower by any definition. 30% of the world's proven reserves of oil and gas are on Russian soil, including staggeringly giant gas fields which were just discovered over the last 4 or 5 years in the Arctic Sea. Russia has 20% of the world's forests in one nation. It has 40% of, if you want to look ahead to the end of this century, it has 40% of the fresh water on Earth. So in resource terms, this is a country that matters greatly. And last but not least, obviously, Russia is a nuclear superpower. It has half of the world's nuclear weapons. We have the other half. And many of those weapons, Rose confirmed, are still targeted on the United States. So the existential importance of Russia is kind of paradoxical in a way, because despite all of these superpower attributes that I mentioned, Russia is still a pretty small country in terms of population and in terms of economic strength. Russia's population is slightly less than 1/2 the population of the United States. More importantly, it is 1/10 the population of China. There are more Chinese living in the border regions between Russia and China, 200, 220 million people, than the entire population of Russia, east and west. GDP terms, the Russian economy is 10 times smaller than the American economy. It's about 8 times smaller than the Chinese economy. And in both in terms of population and in terms of economic growth, Russia is falling behind. I looked at the figures for 2018. Russia was closer to both China and the United States in terms of population and economy. No progress, really, over the last 8 years. So as Ron said, for most of the 20th century, the geopolitical rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union was the single most dominant and defining feature of global international relations. Now, that's a period, we're talking about the period from the end of World War II until let's say the mid-1990s. That marks the high water point of Russia's influence in the world, going back 5 centuries. And that's very important to keep in mind when we think about Russia. Because after the Soviet Union collapsed and broke into pieces, all of that influence, all of that might disappeared practically overnight. Just in territorial terms, Russia, when the Soviet Union broke up, lost 24% of its sovereign territory. Almost 1/4 of sovereign territory in the Soviet Union ruled by Moscow was lost. And if you count the Warsaw Pact as part of the Soviet Empire, as you have to, then that figure rises to 28%. So what we're dealing with here, and what we have been dealing with since these losses, is a country that feels deeply wounded. And I know this from my own experience. Rose knows it from her experience. We know many Russians. We have many Russian friends. We know many Russians who are very pro-Western, and yet they feel achingly this sense that they have lost something. And that allows the political leadership in the Kremlin to exploit these feelings and to portray the West in general and the United States in particular as the engineers of Russia's demise. We were behind the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. We were behind the Chechen war that cost Russia so much in terms of money, blood, and turmoil. This is the narrative that is being fed to the Russian people on a daily basis, and it's largely accepted because these are many people who either grew up during the Cold War or whose parents grew up during the Cold War, and this was their daily bread. The West is out to get us, basically. And Putin and his comrades in the Kremlin are determined to try to regain some of what they lost. And that brings us to the present, to the war with Ukraine, which is now in its 4th year. So I think it's clear that I hope it's clear that we ignore or try to diminish Russia, marginalize Russia at our peril. But how the United States deals with the consequences of the war in Ukraine and the state of our own relations with Russia calls for us to adopt a bifurcated strategy towards Moscow. So I'll talk about those two directions. First, in the short term. In the short term, our national interests demand that we focus on ensuring that Russia is thwarted in its goal of denying Ukraine the right to exist as a sovereign and independent nation. Russia cannot succeed in what it set out to do. We can talk later in more detail about how to achieve this, whether it's through sanctions, tariffs, increased economic pressure, more international isolation by enhancing Ukraine's military capabilities, or through some sort of international mediation. However we get there, the point is that Putin and the Russian elite need to conclude at the end of all of this that what they gained in terms of territory, because they're going to gain some territory, was worth less, perhaps much less, than the price they paid in human losses, in the degradation of the Russian military, and in the enormous economic losses. So that needs to be our focus over the next 6 to 18 months, hopefully not longer than that. And we need not do this by ourselves. We have willing allies in Europe and in Asia, our closest allies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, obviously all the NATO countries, the EU countries are behind us on this, and they are willing to do more to help the Ukrainians. They're looking for us to take the lead, or at least to show that the way is open for them to take the lead. So that's in the short term. In the long term, at the very same time, and this is difficult to do, we need to keep sight of our vital strategic interest in keeping open the lines of communications with Russia's political leadership and maintaining and even building on the links that exist between our two societies. At a minimum, this means we need to ensure that we are in regular, substantive discussions with Russia about continued reductions in the nuclear arsenals that we talked about, and, as Rose alluded, about strategizing together with the Russians on the next chapter about how we bring the Chinese, and perhaps others, but especially the Chinese, to the table for a new series of multilateral arms control talks. Because currently Russia and the United States each have about 1,500 warheads. The estimates are that by 2035, and I might guess even sooner, China will also have 15,000 warheads. So they will be a peer.
1,500.
Pardon?
1,500.
1,500 warheads. So they will be a peer. And believe me, that concerns the Russians very much more than it does even us. So no matter how we might seek to punish Russia for its aggression against Ukraine, we should never try to cut Russia off or cut Russia out completely. Russia is a global great power, and it needs to be treated with a commensurate degree of respect and regard. I would make the point to Russians quite often that the only respect that's worth having is the respect that you earn, not the respect that you coerce or compel others to show you. But the Russians will take it any way they can. Historically, the view has always been, you either respect us or we will make you fear us. And that's what's happening in Ukraine right now. So that's the essential minimum. But at the same time, ideally, we should be working on keeping open those lines of communications and links to Russian society in science, in education, in culture, in travel and tourism, with two main goals. First, to discredit the Russian narrative that I talked about, that it's Russia against the world, that America hates Russia. The reality is quite different, And we need to be able to show that it's different. And the only way to show that it's different is to encourage those many Russians who don't see the West or us as an enemy, and who value the links that I mentioned in science, in technology, in education. We need to encourage and find ways to stay connected to those Russians who see a better future for their country in closer association with the Europeans and with the United States. Because the Russian regime will not last forever, despite the fact that Putin and Xi were captured on a hot mic talking about major organ transplants as a way to live forever. Putin is not going to live forever.
That was kind of creepy, wasn't it?
Oh, that was very creepy. But experience shows that we cannot predict what will follow, what we see in the Kremlin now. It could be worse, it could be better, we don't know. We need to be ready. So if I could sum it all up in a nutshell, don't give in to Putin, but don't give up on Russia. And understand how those two equations are completely different. Thanks very much.
Well, understanding that I do not bring Kathy Novelli's background to this, but I still want to make a few comments about the economic situation because I think it's terribly, terribly important. As I said at the beginning, the European relationship has been a major underpinning of U.S. prosperity for 70 years. The economic issues with the Europeans are tangled with the political, and it makes understanding what's going on and projecting very difficult. And also, Europe is much larger than a single country and much more important, but it is not yet, may never be, a unity or a single country. And therefore, Henry Kissinger famously said when asked about why don't you work more with the Europeans, what's the telephone number? Give me the number. Well, there isn't, of course, one. There's quite a few. As the EU has expanded, there are more. But what is happening now is in some ways potentially transformational. The US has given much, particularly in security. It has profited from a central position within the institutions of finance, the institutions of trade, and the institution of the military. It is now calling into question whether it wishes to retain that position. And essentially, the tariffs, the argument of the tariffs is, you haven't been fair with us. Our deficits are up. Of course, if you look at the deficit as a function not only of trade but of services, it isn't actually true. But there's much of what we export is services that brings in money. But the fact is that we have benefited from this position. Now we are calling this position into doubt in a variety of ways. And there are short-term issues and there are long-term issues which are much more speculative, but which one needs to look at. So President Trump has reached a sort of framework trade deal with the EU. An enormous amount of it needs to be specified and brought into detail. All of these trade deals that are trumpeted are frameworks with all the details which are actually going to matter yet to be figured out. There's a certain quality of smoke and mirrors here. Well, some of the smoke might result from real fires. The mirrors may have real reflections, but there's a certain quality of the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain here. But the security and the economic deals are tangled up. So the recent EU trade agreement with the US is enormously favorable to the US. EU's made promises about how much they're going to invest, how much more they're going to buy from the US, and in return, we'll only put part of the tariffs on that we were putting on before, but we're still putting on more tariffs I mean, this is by any logic a kind of rotten deal. This is a sort of, this is, to be quite critical, this is a protection racket. We want you to pay us so that we don't harm you. But what we're protecting you from is ourselves. We're not actually offering to protect you against anybody else. It's a very limited insurance policy. But the EU has bought into this deal, and I profited from having Kathy here, who had been talking to some of her EU colleagues, who are saying, quite frankly, they bought into this deal in order to keep us, the US, involved with Europe because of the critical importance of Ukraine. And I think that tells you a number of things. It tells you that in the short run, we're getting away with it. It tells you how nervous the Europeans are about their ability to sustain the position of Ukraine without us, how nervous they are about what we'll do. Now, that doesn't mean we won't perform. President Trump loves to live in this kind of uncertainty because it keeps everybody else attentive to him. And sometimes it works. But in doing this, what we are doing is we are depending on your point of view, you could say we are instrumentalizing, or you could say we are weaponizing our key role in a lot of economic institutions. One of which, for instance, is the most critical one, perhaps, is the importance of the dollar. So, because the dollar is the primary reserve currency of the world, people buy our treasury notes. And that allows us to keep the price of the interest fairly low. Now, if, as we mess about with economic sanctions using our treasury position and tariffs, other instruments, we cause people to react and to lose faith in that dependability of the US dollar, then it will cost more to sell our treasury notes, and the cost of paying the interest on our enormous debts will go up, and the debts will continue to swallow an even larger portion of the domestic of our budget, leaving even less of our budget for all the things we fight about. That's already the case, but it'll be less. That has not happened yet. So to say that it could happen is to point out a possibility. It is not to be analytically certain that it will happen. And I think too much of the kind of debate of today is based on asserting that these things must happen. They're countervailing tendencies. There's no other currency that provides the amount of security of the dollar. It is very difficult to organize other forms of economic cooperation than those that have dominated the world for 70 years. It doesn't happen overnight. There have been multiple attempts, discussions about alternative reserve currencies for paying debts, whether it's cryptocurrency or trade between Russians and Chinese using their national currency. And these have made some progress, but none of them have been world-shaking in their. So this is one of the pieces of the economic puzzle. Right now, we are undermining the confidence that much of the world has had in the role of the dollar, in the obligations of international trade agreements, and in the American security role. To say it is undermining is not to say that it has undermined. None of these things have collapsed. And that's sort of what I want to leave you in, is this is a transitional period. It is not a certainty where any of this is going. But the potential of this is very, very large. So I'm going to quit there, both limited knowledge, feeling that I must by now have raised your uncertainty and confusion to a higher level of detail. And we will go on to your question. But I'm going to start with one question to my colleagues, both of whom have extensive knowledge of Russia. The current behavior over the Ukraine, the muttering of threats which are not followed up, the indefinite expansion of 2-week deadlines
You mean by the U.S.?
by the US, and now the rather flaccid response to drones. How does all this play in Russia and with Mr. Putin? Does it make it more likely that he will take risks? Does it matter? What's the impact on the calculation as he looks at us and the chances that he does things that may produce results?
Well, perhaps I'll start because I've been puzzling over this matter the last week, almost week, since the drone incursion on Wednesday. I do think that increasingly, I believe that Putin was testing the United States and testing NATO, and the idea that it's unbelievable to me that after this attempt, this very serious attempt by the President of the United States, inviting him to Alaska, talking about peace in Ukraine incessantly since he came into office, and really trying to get some momentum behind a peace process, that Putin would then turn around and test the United States and test the NATO alliance because of the questions, I believe, that Mr. Trump has raised about the continuing commitment of the United States to defending Europe. I do believe that this was a test. And that's why I wanted to stress for you the message that NATO responded appropriately with well-practiced defense against an air incursion. And that was very important that they were able to show, because that delivered a strong back at you, Mr. Putin message, a strong deterrence message. If the United States is indifferent, or if the United States is not paying as much attention to Europe and its defense anymore, nevertheless, we are ready to respond. We, the NATO European countries, are ready to bring intensive defensive capabilities to bear very, very quickly. So that, to me, was a very strong and important message by the NATO allies in Europe. And we've since seen them speaking out very firmly and clearly, again, in the context of the UN Security Council meeting on Friday. All of the NATO allies and a number of partners, 48 countries, joined together to condemn the Russian incursion and to very strongly support the continued defense of Europe as well as the defense of Ukraine. So I think those are some very important messages. Now, and John, I'll turn the floor over to him now, but John and I would both agree, I think, that for Mr. Putin, probably his most treasured partner is the one in the White House, in the Oval Office. And so he may not care so much about the strong, unequivocal response from NATO, but I do think it was a deterrence message not only to him, if he tends to discount it, but to his military and to others who would have to think very hard about what kind of response they could mount if somehow Putin insisted on further aggression against NATO. The message into the Russian General Staff, the Russian Ministry of Defense, wow, these guys know what they're about, they know how to defend, and they know how to bring force posture to bear very, very quickly, that they could pull together this defensive action within really hours. And so that was, I think, a very, very important message to Moscow overall. Maybe Putin's not quite absorbing it the way he should, but I do think it was an important message from NATO.
As
John?
we turn it over to John, though, I want to push this question. The Europeans respond well and forcefully, but is Putin's perspective, and I know you have to guess, that this shows they can really fight? Or is this a feeble gesture of essentially Lilliputian powers with limited capacity in the absence of the United States to bolster them and to sustain them? Is it a bluff, or does it show real capacity, and therefore do I, Mr. Putin, have to pay it any attention?
I don't think the Dutch F-35s are a Lilliputian capacity. I'll just
But
say
there's
it.
only, I mean, there are a few planes. There are a few, they're limited numbers, and they're hugely limited in the ability to, as we are, in the ability to sustain prolonged conflict. It's one of the lessons we've taken out of Ukraine, is that we all need a lot more munitions.
Well,
There-
we all, of course, we all
Yep.
need to, and that's part of the rearmament that's going on in Europe right now. That was a good message.
I'm not trying to
But
make
anyway,
light of the Europeans. I'm trying to push the question of does Putin, looking at this, take it with the seriousness that you think he suggesting he should be taking it?
yeah. All
Yeah,
I'm saying is
yeah, he
there's a
does.
discount there for Mr. Putin, but I do think that the Ministry of Defense in Moscow took strong note of what happened last Wednesday.
Putin respects one thing and one thing only. Altogether, strength. Strength. If you show strength, Putin will back off. And I think what's important about what happened last week is that what the Europeans were able to do, what NATO was able to do on its own, without leadership by the United States, sends a very powerful message to Putin. He was counting, I think, on a very tepid Lilliputian response, and he didn't get that, even though the United States was not frontally, first and foremost, involved in this. I think it's beyond dispute that what Putin has done in Ukraine has strengthened the alliance tremendously. And I look at a woman here who's wearing a Sweden t-shirt and remembering that NATO has 2 new members now, Sweden and Finland, because of Mr. Putin.
But it didn't keep him from sending some more drones into Romania this morning or last night.
He'll keep probing. There's no question about it. But there's a point at which, he won't go beyond. He's not going to send ground forces into a NATO country right now. I don't know if you agree with me, Rose, but I think that is still a red line.
Well, and
Putin.
also we have to remember that the Russian armed forces have been greatly weakened in this war. They have managed to lose the majority of their armor capability. They don't have the armor now to mount an invasion of the NATO countries because it's been destroyed in their war with Ukraine. And so, of course, they're carrying out this air war now. And this is a big change for all of us to take account of, is this massive now proliferation of very cheap unmanned aerial vehicles, the UAVs, the smaller cruise missiles, and we all have to begin to develop our capabilities to fight in this way. But in terms of a major ground invasion of NATO, the Russians just don't have it at the moment. They don't have the capacity.
Now, we'll go over to our colleague co-host, Dana Kelly, who actually has control of the questions.
So let me just say that we have collected a number of questions from the audience when people registered. So we have a ton of questions. I am going to actually let my dean ask the very first question because she didn't fill out the form.
Oh, you're
Thank
taking
you
it
so
away
much,
from Naya.
and good
Okay.
afternoon, everybody. I wonder if you can comment on one additional leader, and that's Zelensky. What advice would you provide to Zelensky? And if you don't want to answer that directly, what do you think our NATO allies are advising to him behind closed doors as he navigates?
Why don't you start this time, or you, Ron, on that?
No,
You're going to duck?
well, I don't know that I know. I mean, I grant you that we are full of opinions. I mean, I would, all right, I will say one thing. Zelensky obviously learned from his first encounter with Mr. Trump. He took absolutely the wrong approach, and it didn't work. And he's been far, far more adroit. How much that's him, how much it's good counsel, I have no idea. And that is certainly, that at least is at the edge of my knowledge, ability to speculate, if not well beyond it. But what is he getting from the Europeans? How much does he believe that he has strength? You know, how much caution, how much belief? What do you think?
Well, I think what he's hearing from the Europeans is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians see what they're dealing with in Washington: inconstancy, weakness. And the Europeans are telling Zelensky, or they better be telling Zelensky, that they have Ukraine's back in the absence of the kind of support that used to come from the United States. Zelensky has to believe that, and the Europeans have a stake in ensuring that he believes it, and part of what they're doing is the build-up in transfer of military capability and training to Ukraine. I think that we talk a lot about security guarantees for Ukraine as part of this equation. The only security guarantee for Ukraine that counts is an Article 5 guarantee, and that's just not on the table. So I think instead of talking about looking at how we could craft some sort of security guarantee or assurance, because remember, the Ukrainians had a security assurance in the Budapest Memorandum, and that was an assurance, not a guarantee, but it didn't amount to anything at all. So I think it's more important to build up Ukraine's military capability as a deterrent. That, to my mind, is the strongest security guarantee that the Ukrainians can aspire to. Rose?
I wanted to bring up what to me is a very interesting phenomenon. Some of you might remember that in 2012, 2013, Ukraine was trying to join the European Union. They wanted to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And it was at that point that Putin had his first sharp reaction, and particularly after the so-called Euromaidan, demonstrations in Ukraine. That was when the decision was made to invade for the first time and seize Crimea and destabilize the Donbass. So this all started because of the European Union. But in the ensuing decade, for some reason that I still cannot understand, European Union membership for Ukraine has become okay. And Putin has said that, and Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has said that, and the EU has started accession talks with the Ukrainians so that Ukraine can join the European Union. So this, to me, is a fascinating phenomenon. Yes, at the moment, NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table. The Trump administration has been clear that the package that they are trying to devise to create for war termination in this case does not include NATO membership. But as long as NATO membership remains on the table and the Ukrainians can aspire and work at all speed toward EU membership, everything they do to prepare for EU membership will prepare them for eventual NATO membership. At the same time, this is happening, which is an extraordinary phenomenon, given, again, Russia's and Putin himself, his opposition to EU membership. Now they're fine. So let's put intensive activity here. And this is, I think, what Zelensky is hearing from the Europeans. And at the same time, then, the European Union has a separate process going on because they are concerned about the necessity of strategic autonomy. That the United States, again, go back to my first comments about pivoting to Asia, starting with President Obama, that the United States is going to abandon them to their own defense. And so strategic autonomy has been a topic that President Macron, for example, in France, has really been hitting on for a long time, that the EU, without the United States and without necessarily NATO, needs to be able to defend itself. So resources and effort are going into that process as well. I argued, and again, my boss, Jens Stoltenberg, always argued that we needed to have EU and NATO working together because NATO already is a profoundly experienced defense organization that has a military command structure that the EU does not have. They would have to recreate it. That's dumb. Don't recreate. Have NATO and the EU work together. And EU, in fact, has been for many years now working to improve military infrastructure in Europe. I mentioned that 1.5% to go to infrastructure improvements to build roads and bridges. Should NATO need to reinforce, you have to have bridges that can take heavy equipment, military equipment, driving across them, roads capable of military reinforcement taking place on them. So these are the kinds of things that the European Union can put its emphasis on. So I believe in close cooperation and coordination between the two, And in the end of the day, I think that's going to smooth the road toward eventual membership in NATO for Ukraine once Mr. Putin leaves the scene, because he has such an allergy to NATO membership that it ain't going to happen as long as he is still in the Kremlin, in my view.
Great, thank you, ambassadors, and thank you, Dean, for your question. I'm Nayab Ali. I'm the program manager for the Wiser Diplomacy Center, and I will be reading out the pre-submitted audience questions for you. Our first question is, do Western countries feel extra pressure to strengthen the existing and new alliances under the threat of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization?
I'll let you guys deal with that one.
That's interesting. I haven't heard Belt and Road Initiative for a long time. It still exists, but it's not really talked about too much. But or at least I don't hear it. But it is part of the attempt by Russia, by China, by India to create an alternative pole of power to what they saw as a very unipolar world after the Soviet Union fell apart and America became either the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright said, or the great hegemon, as the Chinese, Indians, and Russians would have it. So yeah, I think there is certainly great pressure on the Europeans, both in NATO terms and EU terms, to strengthen and offer an alternative to whatever it is the BRICS and Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, are offering. Because in many cases, it seems to me what really underlies these alternative alliances is opposition to the United States as a strong pole of power in the world. I don't think that Putin and Xi really, or that China and Russia really have long-term common interests, but they certainly are united in their desire to take the United States down a peg, to weaken us, because in their calculation, their strength grows to the extent that ours diminishes.
Next question.
How do the Russian cyber operations against Ukraine and other NATO and EU countries fit within President Putin's overall national security agenda?
Well, I'll start on this one. The Russians are, and they have been since the Soviet era, they have been masters at information warfare. And they have seen that as a major part of their MO from the very start of the USSR. Their propaganda operations in peacetime have been unrelenting, disinformation, misinformation, and that continues today. And now we have moved into this period, and we saw it all the time at NATO, even before the current phase of this terrible second invasion of Ukraine and the war that has ensued. But the cyber attacks against NATO 5-6 years ago when I was Deputy Secretary General were unrelenting. And so it is definitely part of what we considered hybrid warfare already unfolding in Europe, gray area attacks sometimes called as well. And so as far as NATO is concerned, the approach was a two-pronged one. One was to build up NATO resilience and ability to defend against cyber attacks. And the second message was one that we did establish, that was to declare cyberspace a domain of warfare and to say that we would defend, create resilience to be able to defend and survive in cyberspace. But number two, we would have offensive cyber tools available to us. So the ability to push back, to counterattack, so to say, would be available to NATO. And this is the position that NATO has had. I will say that NATO, as NATO, does not control these tools. It's individual NATO countries that have cyber offensive capabilities that they can offer up to NATO. And that is how NATO operates in a lot of different spaces. People say, oh, well, they're NATO armed forces. No, there are not NATO armed forces. There are individual armed forces in each of the NATO member states, and they bring their capabilities and capacities to bear in NATO operations. That's why frankly, why to many NATO member states it's so concerning if the United States is going to take, for example, all of our air refueling capabilities and move them to Asia. Well, the NATO countries are going to have to figure out what to do about air refueling, because U.S. has provided a lot of those key enablers, as we call them. And so that's going to be a big investment for the NATO countries. To come back to Ron's earlier mischievous question, yes, NATO has a lot of investment to do to be able, if the United States moves out of NATO and heads toward Asia, it's going to have a lot of work to do to replace those capabilities.
A strong response with a weaker posture, with a weaker capability.
Well, at the moment, the United States and the Trump administration has said they're going to remain in Europe and continue to provide these enablers, but that seed has already been planted that the U.S. might not always be there.
You talked about the tools that NATO can use to counter these threats. There's a similar question.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now,
Okay, great. So you talked about the tools that NATO can employ against the cybersecurity threats. There's a similar question that asks about what specific initiatives NATO and UN has developed to counter cybersecurity threats. Do you want to comment on that?
I think it's pretty much the same question, so why don't we
Okay.
move on?
How has the recent repression in the American media affected communications between the American and European people?
The recent repression in the
American media.
I'm not sure that there's been repression in the American media. I'm not exactly sure what's meant there. I know from my own experience, having friends in Russia, that many of them still find ways to watch and listen to CNN, the BBC. Russia, I think, still leads the world in proxy server creation to simply evade the efforts of the Kremlin to control the information that's coming in. So I don't really think that's Russia, but I think the same thing holds true. I don't think the independence of the American media is really in question or in threat. But anyone disagree with that?
No, the confusion of the American message is probably enhanced by multiple voices that don't agree. But at least there are multiple voices.
How do the current administration's foreign policy positions shift the U.S.-Europe relations compared to the previous administration? Is there a lasting impact from policy changes or less of one because of the political party shift that happens every couple of years in the U.S.?
Do you mind if I?
No, go ahead.
I think it's important to remember that doubt about the U.S. strength and position really began in the Obama administration and then was reinforced in the first Trump. In Obama, you had the question when they refused to carry out any strikes in Syria as a result of the Red Line. That reverberated around the world. And the pivot to Asia that Rose talked about. And then there had this, okay, what do we get? Now we get the Trump, but basically we were sort of in the same place, but little doubts were there. Then you have the first Trump administration and a lot of perturbation in the force. But it was still kind of this, okay, is the U.S. really changing, or are these little ups and downs? Was kind of the increasing question. The Biden administration comes in, I'm simplifying, obviously, but the Biden administration comes in and says, we're back, we're consulting, we're different. The very first thing they do is deal with Afghanistan. They go off and consult with the allies and pay absolutely no attention to what they're told. The Italians want to stay in Afghanistan, the Germans want to stay in. It's a funny world where the Italians, the Germans are more kinetic than the Americans. So we consult and then we ignore. Whether that departure from Afghanistan influenced Putin, God knows. But now you have Trump back again. So what you have, and I wouldn't say there's a conclusion yet, but there is an increasing tendency to say maybe the U.S. is fundamentally changing. Maybe this looking to itself rather than its alliances is more long-term and is not going to be a part of a sort of back and forth fluctuation, which is the nature of the question. I don't think the jury is out on that, but I would say that the question is much, much louder in voices abroad, friends and allies. And the risk there is when people don't know, generally in policy, when they don't know where you stand, they make assumptions. And the US is a colossus. And so friends and enemies, and those who wish to be neither, still need to understand what the US position is because it affects the decisions they make. When they don't know, they guess. When they guess, they may either worst case it and do things wrong, or they may take risks that provoke a response that they thought wouldn't be there. So the jury is not out on whether there is a permanent change in American policy. And Americans are discussing it themselves. We're talking about it. But the level of uncertainty is, I would submit, higher, and therefore the level of either decisions which are not in our interest, even though they're not necessarily opposed to us, or worst case risks that provoke a reaction. Those are all slightly, or at least to some extent, those are all higher in this current world.
I would say that sowing the seeds of uncertainty go back even before the Obama administration to the Bush 43 administration and what happened in Iraq. That's not an example of drawing back isolationism, but it is certainly a good example of go-it-aloneism. Mm-hmm. And that was a crystal clear message to the Europeans, and also, I would add, to the Russians, who saw that you could stand up to the United States, not join the coalition with impunity.
Let's go ahead.
With Germany opening itself up to $500 billion of infrastructure renovations and an unlimited defense budget, do you see the new increases in debt levels in Europe as something that will make countries more or less dependent on the US?
Well, you know, I'm not an economic expert. I wish Kathy were here to tackle that question, but I will say that debt levels have been kept quite low in Europe because of European Union rules and regulations. Germany did seek some, and they have been seeking some relief, but in general, the debt burden here in the United States is much, much greater than in Europe per se. The Germans did seek both European Union kind of flexibility, but also then they took a change, made a change in their constitution in order to be able to raise debt levels. So these are all important. To my mind, they are important steps in this necessary rearmament, and I am sure that my view is that the European governments are going to be cautious about letting their debts get out of control. At least that's my opinion.
They've got a long way to go to catch us.
To catch us, exactly. Been quite constrained. So why don't we jump on?
We're almost at the end of our time today, so I think I have the perfect question to close up the discussion. If you can all give your comments, that would be great. How can we repair the damage caused by the Trump administration, not only to our relationship with European allies, but also on the global stage? How can we rebuild trust?
Well, we could have a whole day seminar on that topic.
Yeah.
I would say in a very short answer that it will be important, once again, for our whole body politic to be involved here. At the moment, we have a strange situation in that our Congress is very, very, supportive. The Republican majority, very, very supportive of whatever the president wants to do. Our court system has been battling back and forth, but unfortunately at the moment our Supreme Court seems to be very much supporting the president in his actions. My own hope is that confidence will be re-strengthened or re-emphasized and restored among our partners and allies around the world, and indeed among countries who look to us as a model by the strength of our institutions coming through this crisis phase and being restored to good health and renewed to good health. Perhaps that is a somewhat, looks optimistic at the moment, but I believe that we do have that opportunity to restore and renew through our democratic processes. So I will leave it at that.
Yeah, I was basically going to say the same thing. As long as we have an independent judiciary and an independent fifth estate, as long as the media is able to report somewhat objectively on what's happening in the world, and the world can see that it's the constitutional system that has the last say, not the president of the moment, then I think the view that we're a nation that can be trusted and that is built on a foundation that's very strong can be preserved. I don't know if it can be strengthened. Maybe the best we can do is preserve it.
Yeah, so two concluding thoughts, I guess. One is ultimately the policies are going to speak for themselves. You can't restore, you can have a basic faith that America continues, which I do, and we'll test it the next couple elections. But faith in its position in the world, in its position in financial institutions, in its position in security, that has to come out of policies that are reasonably clear and consistently applied over time. The reason for uncertainty is the variation in policy. If you want to undo that, then you're going to have clarity over some period of time. Maybe we'll get it, but it's not necessarily, it's not going to be this administration alone, and it's not going to be just the words of the next administration, whoever that is, whether it's different or not. It'll be what is demonstrated and proven over time in the response to actions, to threats, to crises. The other thing I would say is that just leaving you with one more thing to puzzle on so you don't go away sleeping too well. A theme that has come up tonight repeatedly from my colleagues is the increasing strength of the Europeans, militarily, economically. So I would leave you with the question, and I don't have an answer. Once you get out of immediate crises, but you have a much stronger Europe, if you do, militarily and economically, what impact will that have on the long-term leadership of the United States once countries, we will still be important. We're too big not to be important. But the relative dependence on us will be different. And that too may have long-term impacts on relationships, whether or not people trust us. Because if they are increasingly strong, then they have, to some extent, an increased ability to assert their own priorities. They don't have it yet. Will they have it? Will they stop short? Will they really build these strengths? I don't know. I'll leave you to ponder that.
Let's everyone give a round of applause to our speakers. So thank you very much to Rose Gottemuller, John Byerly, and Ron Newman. And thank you very much also to the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, all of you for participating, and I thank you all for coming and look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.